A wounded Navy SEAL hid inside an abandoned ferry lot before dawn, clutching a secret sewn beneath his uniform. His breath was fading, his enemies were closing in, and no one in North Harbor knew he was there. Then a female FBI agent's German Shepherd suddenly pulled her off the road. What Ash found would expose a smiling dental clinic with a terrible secret. If you believe God still sees the forgotten and sends help in the darkest storms, leave amen. Rowan Hale drove north before sunrise, with Lake Superior sleeping to her left like a sheet of silver glass beneath a veil of mist. The road into North Harbor, Michigan, curved between dark pine trees and quiet stretches of water, the kind of road that made a person believe the world could still be gentle if they only looked at it early enough. Rowan was 30 years old, tall and lean, with dark brown hair tied low at the back of her neck, and gray-blue eyes that rarely gave away more than she intended. She wore a Navy field jacket over her FBI vest, not because she liked looking official, but because she had learned that calm authority could steady frightened people before a single word was spoken. She was not coming to North Harbor for a ceremony or a clean little office briefing. She had been sent to support a preliminary investigation into scattered reports of missing migrant laborers around the Lake Superior region. Names that appeared in one county, vanished in another, then dissolved into paperwork no one seemed eager to finish. In the back seat sat Ash, her 5-year-old German Shepherd, large and muscular, with a sable coat marked by a dark saddle along his back and golden-brown highlights at his neck. His ears stood like twin watchtowers, and his amber eyes had the old, thoughtful look of an animal who had seen too many humans pretend not to notice pain. Ash was disciplined, steady, and almost solemn most days. He did not bark for nothing. He did not waste fear. That was why Rowan noticed the moment his body changed. 1 second he was lying still, his muzzle resting near the window. The next, he rose sharply, claws tapping against the seat, chest tight, eyes fixed on a narrow side road, half hidden by frost-pale weeds. "Ash," Rowan said softly, glancing in the mirror. "What is it, boy?" Ash answered with a low whine. Not loud, not dramatic, just a sound pulled from somewhere deep in him, the same sound he had made 2 winters earlier before finding an elderly hiker trapped under a fallen cedar branch. Rowan eased her foot off the gas. The GPS showed the side road leading to Old Ferry Lot, an abandoned parking area once used by a ferry service that had closed years ago. No homes nearby, no open businesses, no reason for anyone to be there before dawn. But Ash pressed one paw against the door and stared as if the road itself had called his name. Rowan's schedule said she should continue toward town. Her instincts said the same. Yet the quiet weight in Ash's eyes told a different story, and Rowan had learned not to ignore the language of a loyal animal. She turned the wheel. The tires whispered off the main road and onto gravel. Old Ferry Lot emerged from the mist like the bones of a forgotten place. Rusted trucks sat in crooked rows. Empty containers leaned under patches of old paint. A weather-beaten shelter stood near the far edge, its cracked windows shining faintly in the gray light. Tall grass moved around the broken pavement, though there was no wind strong enough to stir it. Rowan stepped out, one hand near her radio, the other unclipping Ash's lead. The air smelled of wet metal, lake fog, and something else, faint, sharp, troubling. Ash lowered his head and pulled forward. "Easy," Rowan murmured, but she let him lead. He moved past a row of old delivery vans, circled a collapsed sign, then stopped at the rear of a white refrigerated truck with a dead engine and a half-open door. Ash did not bark. He stood rigid, nose lifted, tail still. Rowan's pulse slowed in that strange way it always did when danger became real. She reached the truck, pulled the door wider, and looked inside. A man sat slumped against the metal wall. He was broad-shouldered, perhaps in his mid-30s, with a square jaw darkened by several days of stubble and short brown hair damp with cold sweat. A torn civilian jacket hung over him, but beneath it, Rowan saw the unmistakable lines of a tactical uniform. Navy SEAL. His face was pale, his breathing shallow, and one hand was clamped tightly against the front of his jacket as if protecting something hidden there. He looked like a man who had crossed a long night by force of will alone, then finally reached the edge of what the body could bear. Rowan climbed in carefully. "I'm FBI. My name is Rowan Hale. Can you hear me?" His eyelids trembled. For one brief second, his eyes opened, blue-gray, clouded with exhaustion, but still alert enough to understand danger. "Don't—" His voice was rough, barely more than breath. "Don't take me to the town hospital." Rowan leaned closer. "Why?" His fingers tightened at his chest. "Someone's waiting there." He swallowed, fighting to stay present. "Dental clinic?" "Not a clinic." Then his head dipped, and the strength left him. A thin metallic creak sliced through the fog behind Rowan, followed by the slow crunch of tires over gravel. For one suspended second, even the lake seemed to stop breathing. Ash turned first. His ears rose high, his body lowering into a silent guard stance. Rowan looked through the cracked truck door and saw two black SUVs rolling into Old Ferry Lot with their lights off. They moved too slowly to be lost and too carefully to be innocent. On the side of one vehicle, a faded magnetic sign read, "Great Lakes Vehicle Recovery." It might have fooled someone passing by on the main road. It did not fool Rowan. She sent a coded distress signal from her field unit, marking her location for the nearest federal contact. Help would come, but not soon enough. The SUVs were already spreading apart, blocking the most obvious exits. Rowan looked at Ash, then at the unconscious man. "We are not winning a direct fight here," she whispered, "so we don't give them one." She dragged the man out with careful urgency, using every bit of strength in her lean frame. He was heavy, and his weakened state made him harder to move, but Rowan had carried frightened witnesses, injured agents, and grief itself through worse mornings. She guided him behind a row of containers where the fog gathered thickest. Ash watched her hands, waiting. Rowan pointed toward the tree line. "Track away, circle wide." Ash understood. He darted across the lot, low and swift, brushing past an old van, knocking loose a hanging strip of rubber, then disappearing toward the woods. A moment later, a clang rang out from the far side of the lot. One of the men near the SUVs shouted, and both groups shifted in that direction. Rowan crouched behind the container with the seal half supported against her shoulder. She could hear boots on gravel, doors opening, a man speaking into a phone. "He's close," the voice said. "The woman at the clinic won't pay unless we bring back the memory card." Memory card, clinic. The words struck Rowan like cold rain. The scattered missing labor reports, the frightened whispers in case files, the strange warning from a half-conscious Navy SEAL, suddenly they were no longer separate pieces. They belonged to one shadow. A man moved closer, his outline cutting through the fog. Rowan held still, one hand braced against the SEAL's chest to steady his breathing. Ash appeared beyond the man like a dark spirit of the pines. Instead of charging, he shoved his shoulder against a loose sheet of metal stacked near an old trailer. It crashed hard against the pavement. The men spun toward the sound, shouting. The gap opened. Rowan moved. She pulled the SEAL toward the narrow service road behind the containers, where weeds nearly swallowed the pavement. Ash rejoined them at the edge of the lot, his amber eyes bright, his breathing controlled. Together they reached Rowan's vehicle hidden near the gravel bend. She eased the man into the back seat, and Ash climbed in beside him, placing his muzzle gently over the man's hand, as if anchoring him to the world. Rowan drove out through the service road, just as voices rose behind them. She did not look back until Old Ferry Lot vanished in the fog. Only then did she glance at the man in the mirror. His torn jacket had shifted, revealing a small stitched cut inside the lining, neat and deliberate like a secret sewn into cloth. Something was hidden there, something people were willing to chase him through the dark to recover. Rowan kept both hands on the wheel and her eyes on the road toward the safe contact point. She had come to North Harbor looking for missing people. Now, before the town had even fully awakened, the case had found her first. Rowan did not drive toward North Harbor Hospital. Every habit in her training told her a weakened man needed doctors, lights, and a clean room. But Caleb Mercer's warning stayed in her mind like a hand on the steering wheel. Someone was waiting there. That was not fear talking. It was the voice of a man who had already seen the trap before anyone else believed it existed. So Rowan kept the SUV low on the back roads, following a narrow route through pines and lake fog toward an old ranger station the FBI had quietly prepared as a safe contact point for the migrant labor investigation. It sat miles from town, half hidden by spruce and cedar, with a tin roof, boarded side windows, and a radio mast disguised among the trees. To a passerby, it looked forgotten. To Rowan, it was the closest thing to shelter the morning could offer. Ash stayed in the back with Caleb, his large sable body curled close but not pressing. The German shepherd's amber eyes moved from Rowan to the man and back again, steady as a lantern in a storm. Caleb's breathing came thin and uneven. He was about 35, broad through the shoulders, his face cut with the hard lines of military discipline and long exhaustion. His brown hair was cropped short, his jaw rough with stubble, and beneath the torn civilian jacket his tactical uniform showed in dark, battered folds. There was something stubborn about him even while unconscious, as if surrender had never been a language he learned well. Rowan had seen that look before in veterans, first responders, old farmers, and grieving widows, the look of people who kept standing long after their bodies asked them to sit down. At the ranger station, Rowan helped Caleb inside and laid him on the narrow cot in the communications room. She locked the door, lowered the blinds, and activated the encrypted unit. Her first call went to Dr. Samuel Reed, a contract forensic medic and former paramedic assigned near North Harbor for witness protection support. Samuel Reed arrived 20 minutes later in an old green pickup with no markings, carrying a black medical bag and the slow, grave calm of a man who had spent most of his life walking into rooms where panic had arrived before him. He was in his early 60s, tall but slightly stooped, with silver hair combed back, brown skin weathered by cold mornings, and kind eyes that missed very little. He spoke softly, never wasting a word, and treated fear as if it were another patient in the room. "He needs a hospital," Samuel said after checking Caleb, "but I understand why you didn't take him to one." "Can you keep him stable?" "For now," Samuel replied, "but for now is not forever." Rowan nodded. She understood. In their line of work, for now was sometimes a bridge, sometimes a prayer. As Samuel worked, Rowan examined Caleb's jacket. The small stitched cut inside the lining had been sewn with care, not by a tailor, but by someone in a hurry who still knew how to hide a secret. She opened it with a small field blade and pulled out a waterproof sleeve no larger than 2 fingers. Inside was a memory card. Caleb stirred the moment she lifted it into the light. His eyes opened halfway, unfocused but urgent. "Card," he rasped. "It's here," Rowan said, holding it where he could see. "You kept it safe." His mouth tightened, not quite relief, not quite pain. "Leo?" Rowan stilled. "Who is Leo?" Caleb's eyes closed again. "Ortiz. He gave it to me. Ferry lot." His breath caught, then steadied under Samuel's hand. "Didn't have time to send it. Phone broke. Signal jammed." He swallowed. They were already there. Rowan inserted the card into the secure reader. The screen blinked once, then filled with folders. At first, the files looked like the bones of a small local fraud case, photographs of a cheerful blue building called Harbor Smile Care, appointment sheets, payment notes, names, and scanned forms. A dental clinic, or something pretending to be one. But as Rowan opened more files, the air in the room seemed to thin. The patient records included details no dental clinic should care about: work sites, immigration status, family addresses, sponsor names, transportation debts, and notes that read like quiet threats. Easy to pressure. Wants to complain. Do not let leave town. A single photograph flickered onto the screen. A gray-haired woman standing beside a smiling man outside the clinic, both holding paper coffee cups in the winter sun. Ash rose from the floor and placed one careful paw at the edge of the table, his eyes fixed on the woman's face. For a breath, no one spoke, as if the room itself recognized a mother waiting for a son who had not come home. Caleb turned his head toward the photo. "Marina Ortiz," he whispered. "Leo's mother." Rowan looked at him. "Tell me." Caleb spoke in fragments at first, the words pulled from him like stones from cold water. Leo Ortiz had been 34, a community interpreter with a gentle voice and a habit of helping people who had no money to pay him. Years earlier, during a brutal snowstorm, Leo had helped Caleb's unit communicate with stranded laborers during a humanitarian operation. He had not worn a uniform, but Caleb said Leo had courage of a quieter kind, the kind that carried blankets, translated fear, and remembered everyone's name. They stayed in touch. Then, 2 weeks ago, Leo called Caleb and said his mother had been trapped by a false debt after visiting Harbor Smile Care. He thought it was just an illegal clinic at first, Caleb said. Then he found records, passports, work routes, names tied to warehouses and farms. Rowan opened another folder. There were truck plates, grainy images of a basement hallway, and a video clip shot at an angle, as if filmed from inside a coat. A woman's voice, smooth and controlled, spoke to a man off camera. The file name read, Elena_Nolan_audio_3. Samuel looked over from the cot. "Elena?" "Elena Vargas," Caleb said. "People call her doctor. She isn't one, not licensed in Michigan." He closed his eyes for a moment. "She runs the clinic." Rowan played only a few seconds. The woman's voice was gentle on the surface, but sharp beneath it, complaining that Nolan had taken too long with the witness problem and that the memory card had to be recovered before it reached federal hands. Rowan stopped the recording. She did not need more for the shape of it to appear. Harbor Smile Care was not merely treating people without a license. It was collecting them, sorting them, tying them to debt, and feeding their fear into something larger. "Who is above Elena?" Rowan asked. Caleb's jaw shifted. "Name on the files, Celeste Morrow, runs a charity for seasonal laborers. Leo said she was the one everyone smiled for in public and feared in private." The name meant something. Rowan had seen it in scattered reports, donation events, worker housing grants, glossy newsletters. No charges, no clean link. Just a name that kept appearing near places where vulnerable adults seemed to vanish into paperwork. Caleb's voice lowered. "Leo called me before he disappeared. He said, 'If I do not make it back, get my mother out of that town.' I came to take him and the evidence to the FBI. But at the ferry lot, he never showed. The card was hidden under a bench where he said it would be." Then the SUVs came. Rowan looked at the screen again. Marina's face stared back, tired but proud, a woman holding herself together because no one had given her permission to fall apart. Ash lowered his muzzle near the photograph, and for the first time that morning, Caleb's hard expression cracked. "He believed she was still alive because she had to be," Caleb whispered. "That was Leo. Hopeful to the point of foolishness?" "Sometimes," Rowan said quietly, "hope is the only reason evidence survives." Before Caleb could answer, Rowan's phone buzzed. No caller ID, just a message across the encrypted device, somehow forced through a narrow channel it should not have found. "Return the soldier. You do not know what door you are opening." Samuel's face hardened. "That came here?" Rowan turned toward the outer monitor. One of the motion cameras had triggered at the edge of the trees. The image was grainy, fog-washed, almost empty. Then a shadow passed between two pines. Too tall for a deer, too still for a wanderer. Ash moved before anyone else. He stepped to the door and stood there without a sound, ears high, body steady, no fear in him, only purpose. Rowan shut off the lamp. The ranger station fell into a dim blue hush. Caleb lay weak on the cot, the memory card beside him on the table, and outside, among the pines, someone was searching for the trail they had left behind. Yet Rowan already knew where the trail truly led, not deeper into the woods, not back to Old Ferry Lot. It led to Harbor Smile Care, the little dental clinic smiling in the bright heart of North Harbor. By mid-morning, Caleb Mercer had been moved again, deeper into federal protection, with Dr. Samuel Reed and 2 trusted agents watching over him in a cabin hidden beyond the northern pines. Rowan hated leaving him while danger still circled like a wolf beyond the tree line, but Caleb had given her what he could: a name, a memory card, and a warning that smelled of rot beneath polished kindness. Now the trail pointed not to the abandoned lot, not to the men in the black SUVs, but to a small blue building in the heart of North Harbor, where a sign promised affordable dental help, and smiling faces hung in the windows like paper angels. Rowan returned to town with Ash at her side, not as a lone agent charging through the front door, but with a small interagency review team under the quiet cover of a community health and labor services assessment. It gave her limited access, not enough to tear open walls or seize every drawer, but enough to step inside and breathe the air. North Harbor looked almost painfully innocent in daylight. A bakery on Harbor Street pushed warm cinnamon and coffee into the cold morning. The white church bell chimed 10 slow notes. 2 elderly men sat on a bench outside the post office, arguing softly about fishing weather as if evil had never learned their address. Sunlight touched the wet pavement, and for a moment Rowan understood why people trusted beautiful places too easily. Harbor Smile Care sat between a flower shop and a narrow laundromat, painted pale blue with white trim. The sign above the door read, "Affordable Dental Help for Working Families." On the windows were photographs of adults smiling in work shirts, holding paper appointment cards, their faces arranged to look grateful. Inside, the waiting room was neat and cheerful. Fresh daisies stood in a glass jar. A little radio played old country music at a gentle volume. The chairs were clean, the magazines stacked square, the scent of mint and disinfectant floating over everything like a polite lie. Elena Vargas came from the hallway with both hands open, as if she welcomed strangers every day and had never feared a question in her life. She was 56, with silver hair curled softly around her face, warm brown eyes, and smooth olive skin that made her appear younger from a distance. She wore a white coat embroidered with Dr. Vargas, though Rowan already knew there was no valid dental license under that name in Michigan. Elena had once been a dental assistant, not a dentist, but the community had given her the title because she gave them low prices, kind words, and the illusion of care. Her voice was honeyed, her posture motherly, and her smile had the practiced patience of a woman used to being believed. "Agent Hale," Elena said, glancing at the badge Rowan showed only briefly. "Of course, anything for the community. We are only here to help people who have nowhere else to go." Ash stood beside Rowan, large and silent, his sable coat shining under the fluorescent light. Elena's smile faltered for less than a heartbeat when she saw him, then returned. "A beautiful dog." "He is trained to stay quiet unless something needs attention," Rowan said. "That must be useful," Elena replied. "It is." Behind Elena, the patients waited with a stillness that did not belong in a clinic. They did not complain about delays. They did not scroll phones or chat about the weather. They sat with their hands folded, eyes lowered, shoulders tight beneath work jackets. Rowan felt the room watching without looking. Fear, when shared by many people, had its own temperature. Near the hallway stood Victor Salazar, a 70-year-old man with a thin frame, careful gray hair, and a cardigan buttoned neatly over a shirt too formal for volunteer work. He introduced himself as a community translator. His voice was soft, almost grandfatherly, and he smiled with the mild expression of a man who carried cough drops and spare pens. But his eyes never rested. They moved from Rowan's badge to Ash's collar, from the review team's clipboard to the patient's hands. Victor did not look like someone who dragged people into vans. He looked like something quieter, a man who remembered who came, who hesitated, who was afraid, and who might talk. A sharp click echoed from somewhere behind the X-ray room, small as a tooth, snapping shut in the dark. Ash stopped breathing for one strange second, then turned his head toward a locked door at the end of the hall. The music kept playing, the daisies stayed bright, and yet the whole room seemed to lean away from that sound. Rowan looked at Elena. "What is behind that door?" "Storage," Elena said smoothly. "Old equipment mostly. Nothing useful to your review." "Then you will not mind noting it on the facility map." "Of course," Elena said, still smiling. Rowan did not push, not yet. A limited administrative access review was not a search warrant, and Elena knew it. People like her survived by hiding behind rules until someone else broke them first. Rowan would not give her that gift. In the back hallway, near a mop closet, Rowan found Marina Ortiz wiping the floor with slow, careful strokes. Marina was 58, small-boned but not fragile, with black hair streaked heavily in gray and pulled into a loose knot. Her brown face was lined by work, worry, and the long discipline of not crying where enemies could see it. She wore a faded blue sweater under an apron and kept one hand near her pocket, as if protecting whatever little proof of herself remained there. "Mrs. Ortiz?" Rowan asked quietly. Marina's eyes lifted, then darted toward the hallway. "I have work." "I know about Leo." The mop stilled. Ash sat down beside Marina, not touching her, only lowering his head with the grave gentleness of a dog who understood grief better than most people understood silence. Marina's lips trembled once. She looked at Ash first, then Rowan, and something in her seemed to loosen by the smallest thread. "They said he left," Marina whispered. "My Leo would not leave without telling me. He found a cabinet. Papers, passports, names, trucks behind the clinic at night. He said he would give everything to Caleb." Her voice thinned. "Then he was gone. Why are you still here?" Marina's eyes filled, but she held the tears back. "They keep my papers. They say I owe for treatment. They know where my sister lives. They say if I ask again, I disappear like him." Footsteps sounded. Marina bent over the mop again before Elena appeared at the far end of the hall. "Mrs. Ortiz is very grateful for the work arrangement," Elena said. "It helps her settle her balance." Rowan met Elena's smile and saw the cold room behind it. Outside, as Rowan stepped back onto the bright sidewalk, a woman emerged from the laundromat next door. Ruth Calder was 61, broad-hipped and sturdy, with sharp blue eyes, short iron-gray hair, and hands reddened from years of soap and hot water. She wore a plaid shirt under a quilted vest and had the wary look of someone who had survived by trusting almost no one. Earlier, Rowan had seen her through the clinic window, watching too closely, then signaling Marina to stop talking. Everything about Ruth looked suspicious. "Pretty dog," Ruth muttered, not smiling. Ash looked at her, calm and unreadable. Ruth brushed past Rowan close enough that her sleeve touched Rowan's jacket. "Nice town," she said. "Not always safe for strangers who ask tidy questions." Then she disappeared into the laundromat. Rowan felt the folded paper in her pocket before she moved. She waited until she reached the SUV to open it. Written in a tight, shaky hand were 3 license plate numbers and the words, "Back of Clinic." Thursdays, before sunrise. Ash stood by the open door, but he did not climb in. Instead, he turned back toward Harbor Smile Care and fixed on the rear wall behind the X-ray room. Rowan heard it then, so faint she almost missed it. One soft tap, then another. Then nothing. She could not break the wall. Not on a sound, not with Elena watching. Not without the warrant Grace Ellery would need to build from data, testimony, and law. But Rowan knew what Ash knew. The blue house with daisies in the waiting room was not merely hiding records. It had hidden people. Perhaps it had hidden Leo. Elena waved from the clinic doorway, her smile still perfect beneath the morning sun. Rowan placed Ruth's note beside the memory card case and started the engine. North Harbor gleamed around her, bright and clean and full of church bells. But in Rowan's pocket were 3 plate numbers. In her mind was Marina's trembling voice, and in Ash's amber eyes was the same message he had carried since the road to Old Ferry Lot. Someone was still waiting to be found. By the time Rowan returned to the safe cabin beyond the pines, the morning light had turned thin and white, pouring through the windows like cold milk. Caleb Mercer sat propped against a pillow, still pale, still moving with careful restraint, but his eyes sharpened the moment Rowan laid Ruth Calder's note beside the memory card. Dr. Samuel Reed stood near the stove with a mug of black coffee in one hand, his silver hair catching the gray light, watching Caleb with the firm patience of a man who had already warned everyone that stubbornness was not a medical treatment. Ash lay beside the table, his amber eyes open, his ears rising every time Rowan said Marina's name. Rowan spread the files, plate numbers, clinic notes, and patient codes across the table until the old wood looked less like furniture and more like a battlefield drawn in paper. The pattern appeared slowly, then all at once. In the clinic data, certain patients had small bird symbols beside their names: lark, heron, sparrow. At first they looked like harmless internal marks, perhaps appointment categories or payment plans. But Ruth's plate numbers matched 3 vehicle logs connected to those same symbols. Lark appeared near a warehouse route, heron near a farm road, sparrow beside a temporary housing site. Caleb leaned forward, one hand pressed lightly against his side as he studied a blurred photograph from the memory card. Larkspur Packing Yard, he said, voice rough but certain. Leo mentioned it, near the Michigan-Wisconsin line. He thought workers were being moved there after they left the clinic. Grace Ellery joined by encrypted call, her face appearing on the small monitor with the no-nonsense expression of a woman who had spent decades separating sympathy from proof. She was in her mid-50s, with short auburn hair streaked with gray, pale skin and sharp green eyes behind narrow glasses. Grace spoke like a judge even when she was not in court, calm, exact, and unwilling to be dazzled by drama. Elena Vargas can be arrested for unlicensed practice if we build it cleanly, she said. But that only cuts off a branch. If Celeste Morrow is directing the movement of people through these work sites, we need living witnesses, transportation links, money trails, and something that places her above Elena. Rowan looked at the bird codes. Then we find the witnesses before they move them. Before Grace could answer, Samuel's phone buzzed. He glanced down and the kind lines around his mouth hardened. The temporary watch team just lost visual on Marina Ortiz. Rowan went still. Lost how? She stepped out of the protected room 10 minutes ago. The agent at the hall camera says she looked frightened, like someone had called her. For one bitter second, Rowan thought of Ruth Calder. Ruth had known Marina was afraid. Ruth had stood close enough to pass a note. Ruth had lived next door to the clinic and washed its linens while pretending not to see. But Ash was already standing, his nose lowered to the folded cloth Marina had left behind at the cabin the night before, a handkerchief worn soft at the edges. He inhaled once, then turned toward the door with a certainty that made accusation feel premature. "Track," Rowan said. Ash led them not to the highway, not toward Harbor Smile Care, but back into North Harbor, down the rear alley behind the laundromat. Ruth Calder opened the back door before Rowan knocked. The laundromat smelled of soap, steam, and old coins. Ruth's sturdy frame filled the doorway, her short iron-gray hair damp from the heat inside, her sharp blue eyes red as if she had not slept. Behind her, half hidden by shelves of folded towels, Marina Ortiz sat on a wooden chair with both hands wrapped around a paper cup. She looked smaller than she had in the clinic, but not broken, only worn thin by too many years of fear. "I did not take her," Ruth said before Rowan spoke. "I hid her." A dryer door slammed somewhere in the laundromat, loud as a thunderclap in the narrow room. Marina flinched. Ash stepped between her and the sound, and for one breath every person there seemed to remember that safety can feel strange when danger has been home for too long. Ruth swallowed hard. Elena's people called her. Said if she talked again, she'd be moved before sunrise. Marina came to me because she didn't know where else to go. Her voice roughened. "I should have helped sooner." Rowan said nothing. She let silence do what pressure could not. Ruth reached beneath a stack of old detergent boxes and pulled out a small spiral notebook. "I washed their clinic sheets for 2 years. At first I told myself cheap work was cheap work. Then I saw the trucks. Same ones, same hours, always before dawn. The night Leo disappeared, Nolan Price's black pickup was behind the clinic." Her eyes dropped. "My nephew works at a cold storage site tied to Morrow's charity. They told me if I talked, he'd pay for it, so I wrote instead." The notebook was filled with plate numbers, dates, times, driver descriptions, and crude sketches of vehicle markings. It was not elegant evidence, but it was human evidence, the kind made by a frightened woman trying to grow a spine 1 page at a time. Rowan placed it in an evidence sleeve. Marina finally spoke. "Leo told Deputy Bell first, before Caleb. He thought a local officer would help." Rowan's gaze lifted. Deputy Mark Bell had already hovered too close to the case, always warning her not to stir town panic, always looking tired when Leo's name came up. Yet, when Rowan called him, his answer was not surprise. It was resignation. They met him near a closed bait shop on the road out of town. Mark Bell was 58, heavy-set, with a gray mustache, weathered cheeks, and a stiff right knee that made every step look earned. His uniform sat neatly on him, but his eyes looked older than the badge. He listened as Rowan laid out the convoy route. Then he removed his hat and stared at the lake road for a long moment. "Leo came to me," he said quietly. "I thought it was a labor dispute. Told him to bring more proof. 2 days later, he was gone." His voice bent under the weight of it. "There's an admin clerk in our department who tips Elena off when complaints come in. I suspected it too late. Since then, I've watched from the edge, trying to keep Marina breathing." He put his hat back on. "I cannot undo what I missed, but I can block the South Service Road." Rowan studied him. "You follow my lead. No hero work?" A sad smile touched his mouth. "Agent Hale, at my age, getting out of the cruiser too fast is hero work." The convoy came before sunrise, 3 white trucks moving through fog along the lake road, spaced like ordinary delivery vehicles. FBI units waited without sirens, hidden beyond the tree line. The first truck carried boxes of cleaning supplies. The second carried old clinic equipment. Everything pointed to those two. But Ash strained toward the third, smaller truck, the plain one with a faded sanitation logo and mud masking the plate. Rowan trusted him. She signaled the team. The third truck veered suddenly toward the South Service Road, where Mark Bell's cruiser rolled across the exit and stopped at an angle. Brakes hissed. Doors opened. Nolan Price stepped down from the passenger side, lean and hard-faced, with close-cut blonde hair, a narrow jaw, and the cold impatience of a man paid to solve problems without asking what they cost. He moved toward the rear door, but Rowan was already there, Ash at her side like a storm given shape. "Federal agent," Rowan called. "Step away from the vehicle." Nolan reached for the door anyway. Ash surged forward just enough to freeze him, not biting, not reckless, only making the promise clear. Rowan closed the distance and brought Nolan to the ground with practiced speed, while agents secured the driver. Mark's cruiser jolted as the truck bumped it, trying to push past. The old deputy struck his shoulder against the doorframe, but stayed upright, jaw clenched, refusing to move. Inside the hidden compartment were Marina and two other adults, both frightened, both clutching small bags as if they had been told this was their only chance to keep a life. Marina stepped down slowly. When she saw Mark Bell, her face hardened. "I am sorry," Mark said, voice low. "I should have believed your son." Marina looked at him for a long time. "Sorry does not bring Leo back." "No," Mark said, "but truth might bring him home to your name." Later, wrapped in a blanket beside an FBI vehicle, Marina gave her first formal statement. Elena had threatened her. Leo had found records in the clinic. There was a basement behind the X-ray room. Trucks came before dawn. People who owed money were moved, not helped. One shaken driver added the piece Grace had been waiting for. Elena only opens the door. Celeste decides who goes through it. As the sun lifted over Lake Superior, the fog thinned into gold. Nolan Price sat in custody. Marina was alive. The convoy was broken. But when Rowan called the cabin, Caleb's voice came weak through the line. "You found the door," he said, "not the house." Ash stood at the edge of the road, looking back toward North Harbor. Tonight, Celeste Morrow would smile beneath chandeliers at Brightwater Hall, raising money for the very people her empire had trapped. Rowan watched the light touch Ash's sable coat and knew the chase had changed shape. It was no longer about proving the clinic was false. It was about reaching the woman who had taught false kindness to wear a crown. Brightwater Hall glowed above Lake Superior like something from an old postcard, all tall windows, polished wood, and golden lights strung through the maple trees along the water. By evening, North Harbor had dressed itself in its finest manners. Cars lined the curved driveway. Men in wool coats and polished shoes greeted one another with careful smiles. Women in soft scarves held donation envelopes and paper cups of cider. Somewhere inside, a string trio played a hymn so gently it almost sounded like forgiveness. Rowan Hale stood near the back of the hall with Ash at her side, watching the town applaud a woman she now believed had built a kingdom out of other people's fear. Celeste Morrow stepped onto the small stage beneath a banner that read, "Dignity Through Work." She was 62, tall and elegant, with silver hair gathered into a smooth knot and a cream-colored suit that made her look less like a suspect than a beloved grandmother at a church luncheon. Her face was softly lined, her skin pale and carefully made up, and her voice carried the warm, steady rhythm of someone who knew how to make a room trust her. She thanked farmers, business owners, warehouse managers, church donors, and local officials. She spoke about opportunity, fair wages, safe housing, and the noble duty of welcoming strangers who came to America with tired hands and brave hearts. Each sentence was beautiful. That was what made Rowan's stomach turn. Lies did not always crawl. Sometimes they stood under chandeliers and received applause. Grace Ellery stood beside Rowan dressed in a dark charcoal coat, her short auburn gray hair tucked behind one ear, sharp green eyes taking in every face that clapped too quickly or looked away too soon. Grace had the stillness of a woman who could wait all night for the right question. "Not yet," she murmured before Rowan could speak. "We do not arrest the crown until we have the throne beneath it." Rowan touched the small earpiece hidden under her hair. Caleb's voice came through faintly from the safe location where Dr. Samuel Reed had forbidden him from leaving the chair unless the building itself caught fire. "That is her," Caleb said. His voice sounded weak but focused. "The voice from the recording. the one who told Elena to clean the list before inspection. On stage, Celeste placed one hand over her heart. "No one should be invisible," she said to the room. "No worker should feel forgotten." Ash's ears twitched. Rowan glanced down. The German shepherd was not looking at Celeste. He was looking toward the side doors leading to the rear lawn and the old boathouse beyond the hall. After the speech, Celeste moved through the crowd like a queen through a chapel, accepting compliments, touching elbows, remembering names. She greeted Rowan with a smile, smooth enough to cover a well. "Agent Hale," she said, as if Rowan were an honored guest rather than a warning bell. "I hear you have had a busy day in our little town." "You follow local news closely," Rowan replied. "When one loves a community, one listens." Celeste's eyes lowered to Ash. "And this must be your famous partner. Beautiful creature, loyal animals are such a blessing." Ash did not move closer. He simply watched her, calm and unreadable. Before Rowan could answer, Ash turned sharply toward the side exit. His body tightened, not with aggression, but with recognition. Rowan followed his gaze. A thin, elderly man in a dark coat slipped through the rear door, carrying a flat archive box. Victor Salazar. A gust of cold lake wind burst through the side entrance, carrying the sharp smell of wet wood and paper smoke. Ash stepped forward at once, and the golden music behind Rowan suddenly felt very far away. Rowan moved. Grace followed. They crossed the rear lawn under strings of warm lights, past laughing donors who never noticed the world splitting open behind them. The boathouse sat at the edge of the water, its old cedar siding silvered by weather. Inside, Victor Salazar knelt near a metal barrel, hands shaking as he tried to tear open folders. He looked smaller than he had at the clinic, his cardigan replaced by a formal coat, too large for his narrow shoulders. His grandfatherly mask had fallen away, leaving only an old man frightened by the machine he had served. "Step away from the documents," Rowan said. Victor froze. "You do not understand." "I think I understand enough." "No," he whispered, eyes wet. "Elena said it was just records. Then Celeste said records become stories, and stories become witnesses." His fingers trembled over the box. "I only watched. I never touched anyone." Grace's voice cut through the room, cold and clean. "Watching is not innocence when watching tells others who to harm." Victor lowered his head. The box held copies of false debt contracts, patient intake forms, plate numbers, and transfer sheets marked with the same bird symbols Rowan had seen earlier. There were also partial bank records showing payments routed through Celeste's labor charity. Not enough alone, but enough to prove the shape of the throne. Victor broke then, not loudly, but like an old fence giving way under snow. He told them Elena had kept a private ledger in the basement of Harbor Smile Care, hidden beneath an old dental chair. It listed dates, drivers, work sites, payments to Nolan Price, and amounts routed upward to Celeste. "Elena called it her life insurance," Victor said, "if Celeste ever decided she was no longer useful." Rowan did not wait. Within minutes, a small federal team moved toward Harbor Smile Care, while Grace began drafting the emergency warrant request with the new evidence. Caleb, still on the line, recognized the basement layout from Leo's hidden video. "There is a chair near the back wall," he said. "Old model, rust on the base. Leo filmed it before everything went dark." By the time Rowan reached the clinic, night had folded over North Harbor. The pale blue building looked smaller in the dark, less cheerful, like a dollhouse with its painted smile washed thin. The rear door stood slightly open. Inside, the mint scent was gone, replaced by harsh cleaning fluid. The daisies were missing from the waiting room. Chairs had been pushed aside. Someone had been trying to erase kindness with bleach and speed. Ash went straight to the hallway behind the X-ray room, then down the narrow basement steps. He moved slowly, nose low, following not numbers or ledgers, but traces of people. Caleb's brief presence from the video equipment, Leo's old scent lingering in dust, Marina's fear embedded in cloth and wood. The basement was unfinished, with low beams, stacked boxes, and a partition wall newer than everything around it. At the far end sat the old dental chair. Caleb's voice came through Rowan's earpiece. "That is it." Ash placed one paw against the chair's metal base and scratched once. Rowan knelt, found a loose plate beneath the footrest, and pulled it free. Inside, wrapped in plastic, was a narrow ledger. Grace exhaled softly behind her. "There it is." Then Ash turned from the chair and pushed his muzzle into a gap behind the partition wall. He tugged at something caught in the wood. Rowan reached in and pulled out a small handkerchief, faded white, embroidered with the letters M.O. in careful blue thread. Marina had been brought in for identification. When she saw it, her hands rose to her mouth. "Leo bought that with his first paycheck," she whispered. "He said every mother should have something nice, even if it is only cloth." The basement seemed to fall silent around her grief. Footsteps sounded above. Elena Vargas appeared at the stairwell, no longer polished, no longer warm. Her silver hair had loosened, and her white coat was gone, replaced by a dark sweater and a face stripped of softness. For 1 second, when her eyes fell on Marina and the handkerchief, something like shame crossed her features. "Elena," Rowan said, "help us find the people still hidden in this network. Help yourself by telling the truth now." Elena's lips parted. "I wanted to help them once," she said. "Do you believe that? I knew what it was like to be poor, to be ignored. Then debts came. Then Celeste came. She made it sound like a system, like everyone owed someone." Her eyes moved to the ledger. "I was not the worst one." "No," Rowan said, "but you chose to keep opening the door." For a fragile breath, Elena looked like a woman standing at the edge of confession. Then her face hardened. She lunged for the ledger. Ash barked once, sharp and final, and Rowan caught Elena before she could reach it. The moment was over. Whatever good had once lived in Elena had been invited forward, and she had turned away from it. As agents secured her, Elena's phone rang on the basement floor. Grace picked it up and put it on speaker. Celeste's voice flowed out, calm as warm tea. "If the ledger is still there, Elena, then you are no longer useful." Elena went pale. The great queen of charity had just discarded her most faithful servant. Grace's phone buzzed seconds later. "Private flight record," she said. "Celeste Morrow. Departure filed from North Harbor Airfield. Wheels up in less than 1 hour." Rowan held the ledger against her chest. Elena was in custody. Victor had confessed. Nolan Price was already secured. The bought clerk inside the local department was named in the papers, but the woman at the top had slipped from the ballroom while everyone was clapping. Ash stood at the foot of the stairs, watching the dark hallway above. The final chase had begun. The ledger from beneath the dental chair changed everything. By midnight, Grace Ellery had turned its plastic-wrapped pages into the kind of evidence even Celeste Morrow's finest attorneys could not polish clean. Names, false debts, work sites, driver numbers, truck plates, payments routed through Celeste's charity, notes about witnesses who had grown uncooperative, and one line that made Marina Ortiz sit very still when Rowan read it aloud. "Leo knows too much. Marina must be kept quiet." Beneath that sentence was a payment entry tied to Nolan Price. It was not a rumor now. It was not a frightened mother's grief. It was ink, dates, money, and intent. Grace moved fast. She was a woman built for pressure, short auburn-gray hair tucked behind her ears, green eyes bright behind narrow glasses, her voice calm enough to make panic feel embarrassed. Emergency warrants went out before the moon had crossed the lake. Federal teams moved on the Morrow Family Workforce Center. 2 cold storage sites, worker housing units, the charity's downtown office, and 3 farms that had hidden behind clean brochures and kind slogans. Rowan rode with Ash toward the Workforce Center, the ledger secured in evidence custody, the memory card copied, the witnesses protected. Caleb Mercer was not supposed to be there, but he had insisted on riding in the command vehicle under Dr. Samuel Reed's watchful eye. He was pale, one arm resting against his side, moving like a man whose body had signed a complaint his spirit refused to read. Samuel, silver-haired and stern, kept muttering that heroism was easier to admire from a medical chart than from a moving vehicle. The first workers came out of the center just before dawn. They were adults of many ages, some with gray at their temples, some with hands roughened by years of fieldwork and warehouse shifts. They walked slowly, carrying plastic bags, folded jackets, and the numb silence of people who had been told too long that help was a trick. Rowan watched one woman clutch a passport to her chest after an agent handed it back. Another man stared at the open gate as if daylight itself required permission. Ash stood near the path, large and steady, his sable coat catching the cold blue morning. He did not bark, he did not crowd them. He simply stood there, a living promise that no one had to run from this door. At North Harbor Airfield, Celeste Morrow was stopped beside a private plane with its steps already lowered. She wore a dark travel coat over her cream suit, her silver hair still perfect, her face composed in that soft grandmotherly mask she had worn beneath the chandeliers. Even in custody, she spoke gently. "This is a misunderstanding," she told Grace. "I have spent my life helping people find work." Grace held up the ledger copy. "You helped yourself to their fear." For the first time, Celeste's smile did not return quickly enough. By mid-morning, the arrests had settled into paperwork, statements, and quiet disbelief. Elena Vargas was in custody. Nolan Price was secured. Victor Salazar had confessed enough to keep investigators busy for weeks. The local administrative clerk who had warned Elena about complaints had been identified. Marina was safe. The main doors had opened. Rowan should have felt the case loosening its grip. But Ash would not get into the vehicle. He stood at the rear of the Morrow Center, staring toward a low-maintenance building almost hidden behind stacked pallets and old equipment crates. One younger agent, broad-shouldered and red-cheeked from the cold, said, "We cleared that shed, just broken machines and storage." Ash gave a low whine and pulled once toward the door. Rowan looked at him and saw Old Ferry Lot again. The pale blue clinic, the convoy in the fog, the basement wall. Every time Ash had refused to move on, someone forgotten had been waiting beyond human certainty. "Open it again," Rowan said. From inside the maintenance shed came one faint scrape, so soft it might have been wood settling in the cold. Ash froze, ears high, and the whole yard seemed to hold its breath. The crates were moved. Behind them was a service door half covered with insulation board. The lock was old but newly oiled. When agents opened it, cold air drifted out, carrying the stale scent of dust, cardboard, and people who had been kept from sunlight. Inside was a narrow room with no windows. 3 adult witnesses sat against the wall, weak, frightened, alive. One man lifted his head. His hair was longer than in the photograph. His face was thinner, his beard uneven, his eyes tired in a way no sleep could quickly mend. But the shape of him was still there. The same gentle mouth from the picture outside Harbor Smile Care. The same quiet strength Caleb had described in the man who once carried blankets through a snowstorm and translated fear into words people could answer. Marina was brought to the doorway. At first she did not move. Her hands rose slowly, trembling before they reached her chest. The man looked at her, lips parting, as if he had crossed an ocean inside himself to find one word. "Mama." Marina made a sound too small to be called a cry and too full to be called anything else. She crossed the room and wrapped her arms around Leo Ortiz, holding him as though the world might change its mind if she loosened her grip. Leo closed his eyes against her shoulder. "I tried to come home," he whispered. "You did," Marina said. "You did." In the lining of Leo's shoe, investigators found a folded piece of food packaging. On it, written in cramped letters, were driver names, transfer dates, and locations he had memorized during his captivity. Celeste had kept him alive as leverage over Marina and as insurance in case Caleb released the evidence. She had hidden him like a secret account. But even in the dark, Leo had kept writing the truth. Caleb stood a few steps away, leaning on a cane Samuel had forced into his hand. His eyes shone, but he smiled when Leo looked over. No speech passed between them. None was needed. A promise had been carried through fear, fog, and pain, and now it stood breathing in the same room. Months later, Harbor Smile Care no longer wore its false smile. After the first court hearings, the building was transferred through a victim recovery fund with support from St. Agnes Church and the people of North Harbor. Its new sign read, North Harbor Hope Center. Dr. Samuel Reed came every week to offer lawful care. Grace opened a small legal aid office beside the reception desk. Ruth Calder donated an old washing machine from her laundromat and pretended not to cry when Marina thanked her. Deputy Mark Bell retired from the department, but every morning he arrived early to make coffee, wipe down chairs, and greet people with awkward kindness. The day he tried to hang the front sign, it leaned so badly that even Ash seemed to tilt his head in judgment, and laughter filled the sidewalk like spring rain. Marina and Leo opened a community kitchen behind St. Agnes. The first soup they served was called Ash's Soup. Marina said the name with tears in her eyes and a smile on her face. That dog did not just find my son. He found the hope I thought I had lost. Caleb healed slowly, which was the only honest way to heal. He testified, helped witnesses prepare their statements, and learned to sit still when Samuel glared at him. Rowan remained Rowan, steady, watchful, not easily carried away. But sometimes, in the late afternoon, she and Caleb walked Ash by the lake and shared coffee in companionable silence. On the final golden evening of autumn, Rowan stood at the North Harbor Pier while Ash sat beside her like a guardian carved from dusk. Caleb approached with 2 paper cups. Far behind them, Marina and Leo were setting out bread for supper. Ruth was fussing over the new sign. No one gets lost alone. Mark Bell stood on a ladder trying to straighten it, somehow making it worse, and the laughter that followed floated over the water. Caleb looked down at Ash. That dog does not just find missing people. He finds the road home for a whole town. Rowan rested her hand on Ash's head. No, she said softly. He just reminds us not to walk away too soon. The sun lowered over Lake Superior, turning the water to gold. North Harbor was no longer a town hiding fear behind bright windows. It had become a place where the forgotten were named, believed, and led home. And in the last light, Ash sat peacefully beside them, a quiet guardian of hope. At the heart of this story is a simple truth. No one is too forgotten for kindness to find them. Rowan followed the instinct of a faithful dog. Caleb kept a promise when it would have been easier to give up. And Ash reminded an entire town that sometimes the smallest sign of hope can lead us back to the people we thought were lost forever. In life, we may not always face great mysteries or dangerous roads, but every day gives us a chance to notice someone who is hurting, someone who is lonely, or someone who has been quietly waiting for help. A kind word, a patient heart, a shared meal, or a simple act of courage can become the doorway through which another person finds peace again. And let us never forget the animals God places beside us. They may not speak our language, but they often understand love, fear, loyalty, and sorrow in ways that humble the human heart. A faithful dog, a gentle cat, or any creature under our care deserves patience, protection, and tenderness. Sometimes, through their loyal eyes, we are reminded of the goodness God still plants in this world. Maybe miracles do not always arrive with thunder in the sky. Sometimes they come quietly, through a dog who refuses to walk away, a stranger who chooses to care, or a heart that still believes light can return after a long night. If this story touched you, let it be a reminder to live gently, love deeply, protect the vulnerable, and never ignore the small voice inside that tells you to do what is right. If this story moved your heart, please share it with someone who needs a little hope today. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from, or share a moment when an animal brought light into your life. And if you enjoy stories of faith, courage, love, and second chances, please subscribe to the channel so we can keep bringing these stories to you. May God bless you, protect your home, guide your steps, and fill your days with kindness, peace, and quiet miracles.